podcast includes commentary and conversations about issues relevant to clinical psychology. It is intended to educate, entertain, and enlighten, and is not a substitute for actual mental health treatment. Individuals who share personally here choose willingly to tell their stories to benefit you, the listener. All other references to clinical situations are altered or limited to protect confidentiality. For more specific questions or help with a personal situation, please consult a local mental health professional. Therapy, mental health, real life. This is Psych Rally with Los Angeles-based clinical psychologist Dr. Martin Hsia.
Hello and welcome back to the Rally for episode 28. I hope you're having a lovely day today as you are listening in and geared up and ready to hear about what can be, a pretty heavy subject, and that is sex addiction. And we're very fortunate to have my guest today, Sam Louie, talking with us today to discuss his own personal journey with sex addiction. And first, I just want to introduce this topic by sharing a few kind of sort of tidbits about sex addiction that are very much still in discussion, because there's debate out there about whether is it even a real thing, or if it is, should it be called something else, not an addiction? In fact, there was a lot of research done behind the scenes to propose a name for sex addiction to make it a sort of recognized official diagnosis, and it was going to be called hypersexual disorder. And that was proposed for the most recent version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5, which was published in 2013. But in the end, hypersexual disorder was not included. And there's a lot of theories and debates as to why that was the case. But as it stands, hypersexual disorder or sexual addiction is not officially recognized here in the U.S. as a codable, treatable, and in turn, in many cases, is also not a reimbursable condition per se. Now, interestingly, while the American Psychological Association and the DSM don't formally recognize sex addiction or hypersexual disorder, the ICD-10, which is used as the diagnostic manual essentially more internationally, has long included a label of this form, what is called excessive sexual drive. So there's kind of a discrepancy there across borders. Now, some of the criticism comes from folks who say that the term addiction, calling it a sex addiction, is problematic because addiction should apply only to substance addictions, people who are ingesting alcohol or drugs in a problematic way, and that for people with problematic or compulsive sexual habits or gambling, these are what we often call process addictions, that those should be called something else. They shouldn't be called addictions. Now, there are other folks who say that, calling anything an addiction is a problem because that kind of de-emphasizes or takes away a person's individual responsibility for the consequences of their actions and behavior. And, you hear this a lot with critiques of kind of the disease model of 12-step, calling alcoholism a disease. Some people don't like that, that it sort of, again, it takes away accountability. And still others are saying that, legitimizing sex addiction is, the problem with that is that it serves to justify infidelity, and that it can be sort of leaned on as an excuse for someone who has broken the trust of a committed relationship, been unfaithful, because you can sort of say, well, I have a sex addiction, and somehow there's a fear that makes it okay. Now, in the meantime, sex addiction is a more common reference colloquially. You hear about it, you can read about it. You can become certified in our field as a certified sex addiction therapist or get a CSAT. Compulsive sex is increasingly showcased more in American pop culture and films like Shame and shows like Californication, and you have people who are genuinely and desperately struggling with sexual behavior that has gotten out of control, and it's really getting in the way of their own lives. And yet these individuals are people that don't have the validation or the explanatory sort of normalization of a diagnosable label for what they're facing, whether you call it an addiction, a hypersexual disorder, or what have you. So that leaves a lot of people kind of hanging there. And even as awareness is growing and perhaps acceptance and treatment for it is growing as well. So just a little preview of some of the unresolved debates out there around problematic hypersexual behavior, because clearly this is a topic that is, continually evolving in terms of the broad acceptance and understanding of it. But either way, as you hear Sam talking here personally, regardless of where you currently may stand on any of these topics, I'd invite you and encourage you to interact with Sam's personal story and his journey here with kind of just open ears. Because in other situations, I think what really matters is just being able to hear a real person talk about real lived experiences and real struggles, and maybe being able to learn something new, regardless of the language or categories that we have to understand it. All right, so we are very fortunate today to be talking with Sam Louie, who is himself a marriage and family therapist practicing in the Seattle, Washington area, and we were somehow miraculously able to line up our schedules to talk and record here in person, as he's here visiting SoCal and literally just got off a plane and came over here to my office. So glad we could do this, Sam. Thanks for coming over and talking today.
Oh, thanks, Martin.
Well, why don't we just have you introduce yourself briefly, kind of your background geographically, culturally, and then how maybe lead us into your journey sexually and when you would say that started to become a problem.
Okay. I am considered a 1.5 generation Chinese American immigrant from Hong Kong. And for those who might not be familiar, 1.5 meaning I arrived in the States, the Seattle area, when I was 4 or 5 years old. More so than that, or another aspect of landing in Seattle when I was really young, it was a predominantly African-American neighborhood at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So when my parents immigrated, my dad was 31, my mom was 27. They could have stayed in Hong Kong with other family members. My dad was a chef, so apparently some of his other peers that stayed did really well, but he was really thinking about us, meaning me and my 2 younger brothers, in terms of education and how can we best give them the best opportunity possible.
Very much a selfless act.
Yeah,
right.
and it's hard to still wrap my head around that. I'm a relatively new father, so
Right.
I can kind of
Congratulations.
understand that piece, but it's still hard to think, oh my gosh, imagine being very fluent in one language, meaning right now English, and then in my 30s I'm launching somewhere I'll do the reverse, go to Asia
You're
with
right.
very limited understanding of the culture and the language and be expected to start over.
And completely uproot everything around you,
Yeah.
just detach from other family members probably,
Yep.
and friends, yeah. So that's how you got here to the States?
That's how I started. The term, we now know it as latchkey kids,
Yeah.
but at the time, we thought we were just kids running around playing and enjoying ourselves.
That's all you knew.
No adult supervision. You're just out there making things up. And Dad, as I said, was working as a cook at the time, so he was gone for most of the day, and you didn't see him until maybe late at night.
Yeah.
But by then he was wiped out because he had to start the day over again.
Yeah.
And I think he was working 6 days out of the week at the very least.
Boy.
My mom at the time, she was taking care of us, me, and my 2 younger brothers. So there were stressors with raising 3 boys at the time, 5, 4, and 3.
Sure. I hear that's still the case.
Yeah, still the case. She ended up getting a job as a waitress at a different Chinese restaurant. And so I remember a lot of our days, at least in the summer, were at grandma's, grandparents, which they lived close by. But once again, grandparents, they're doing their own thing. They're speaking to you in Chinese. You're trying to understand them, but there's already the communication and cultural gap. So you're just off playing with the neighborhood kids.
Yeah.
A lot of African-American kids. There was a burgeoning Asian community that was starting. So it was Black and Asian, and everybody just kind of coalescing and trying to figure out America on our own.
Yep.
So I wrote down the term culture of stoicism because that's what I know. My parents just put on a good, strong face and tried to muscle through whatever challenges that came their way. I never saw them frustrated. I never saw anything other than a cheery appearance. So they were always happy, very friendly. And even when friends would come over or go out with us to our family gatherings, they're like, wow, Sam, you guys have such a happy family. And to an extent, it was very happy and jovial. But there were really, when I look back, but there were any real feelings being communicated. So that was why I said stoicism, because you can only put on one particular image, which was we're happy, we're adjusting to America the best we can, and we're connecting with other Cantonese immigrants from Hong Kong.
Yeah, but there wasn't an encouragement of expressing the full range of struggle that transition brought, for sure.
So another piece is, unlike maybe other immigrants or newer immigrants who have education, my parents were not educated. My dad was the oldest of 8 kids, so he actually had to start working starting 13 or 14 years old on his own to try to support the family as a kitchen help, and that's how he even started.
Got those skills.
Yeah, skills in terms of cooking. So I was the oldest of 3. I knew that as the oldest son.
Of the oldest son.
The
oldest of the oldest.
Nothing was ever communicated in terms of expectations explicitly, other than do a good job, get good grades, so on and so forth. But I do remember learning very early on how to write my name in Chinese. And, phonetically, it's Louis Fuyan. And my dad and my mom emphasized, hey, it doesn't matter who you are individually, the Fu Yan part. What's most critical is your last name, the Louis. So whatever you do, you want to make sure that this represents, whatever you do is going to represent us.
Right. Bring the family name, honor, and prestige, and not disgrace. cannot
dishonor. They never use these terms of don't dishonor, but it was kind of understood that you want to do whatever you can to elevate the family name.
Sure.
Being the oldest of 3, that's what I did, thinking I needed to do the best I could as an example for my 2 younger brothers. Eventually, there comes a point where you want to be... You're in an environment in an American schooling system where everybody is telling you to be yourself, think on your own, raise your hand, speak up. So the notion of having your own thoughts starts
causing conflict.
Yeah, I'm hearing one thing. I go to school like, hey, Sam, what do you think from your teachers?
What?
And then at home, like, don't think, don't speak, just know your role. You're the oldest son. Just do what you're supposed to do, which was very confusing.
Yeah. Was there a certain point where you really started noticing, if you look back, that caused some tension for you?
Up until middle school, I think I just followed the mantra, just follow the family drill. Yeah. In middle school, being the oldest, regardless of being the oldest, I think I just wanted some things that may have caused some anxiety for my mom. And specifically, I remember I wanted to help out with a friend on his paper route. They had weekly paper routes, which was, just weeklies. You earn some money and, hey, I wanted to do this. But I remember my mom just said no. So there was no explanation. There was no conversation. There was no teasing out of how's your school? Can we balance this back and forth? It was just no. I did not like the no, so I snuck around her back and did it anyways without telling her. And I told her that I had another day of student council meetings. I had student council meetings on Tuesdays, so I stayed after school, came home a little later. And I said, I could just repeat this drill and just say I'm doing it on Wednesday. I'm not sure how she caught on, but she eventually did catch on. And I had to give up the paper route, or I did give up the paper route. So that was my first resistance, so to speak. Another one that I wanted to wear, I didn't want to wear bell bottoms anymore, even though they may have come into fashion at one point.
Oh, this was when they came back.
No, this was when they were out of fashion. Oh, okay. So kids are making fun of your bell bottoms.
You were behind the times.
I was behind the times all the time. And so I had bell bottoms, and the girl next to me I liked her, I think, because it impacted me when she laughed at him. But she was laughing in a playful way. It's like, hey, Sam, those are cute bell bottoms. But I misinterpreted it, and I said I can never wear these bell bottoms again. So one morning, I resisted, so to speak, when my mom said, hey, you got to go to school. I said, Mom, I can't go to school. Look, all we have are these bell bottoms. I'm not going to school. She's like, that's all we have. You got to go to school. And that was the one day I missed out of 2 years, impacted my perfect attendance because I was that stubborn and not wanting to wear bell bottoms for fear of ridicule from her or others.
Think about what a reason to miss a day of school. Now as adults, thinking back, those darn bell bottoms. Gosh, even after they were out of style.
I know, bell bottoms. Yeah, but those were moments I think were big in middle school. But even earlier, I remember when I think about just this concept of shame that I write about and talk about, started kicking in when received some money somehow, maybe Chinese red envelope money, and then I wanted to buy some candy or ice cream for the kids in my neighborhood, like a couple of my friends, right? And then I bought them. My mom found out, and then my mom criticized me and saying, why did you buy these two candy or ice cream and not buy your brother's candy and ice cream?
Too outward looking there.
Yeah, and then at the time I was like, well, I was just trying to do a nice thing for my friends, but I felt really bad for probably one of the first early experiences of questioning, okay, did I do something wrong here because I didn't think about my brothers first, which was more the family-centric way my parents were probably raised?
Yeah, it's funny. And in another such situation, I could picture, going out and like, I'm buying the candy for everyone else. That's kind of a very Chinese gesture to do. Like, look at me.
Yeah. If you buy
I'm
it for
picking
the
up the
family,
tab,
that'd be
right.
fine.
Yeah,
but
maybe.
I think since you're buying it for not only non-family but non-Asian kids,
family.
I think my mom just looked at me kind of really. I still can remember the sting of that. Since we are talking about the addiction piece and pornography, even before then, part of what I had learned was an easy way to disconnect. So there are many days when I remember I would disconnect and just be in my room listening to music all day, either the same songs or the same CDs just playing over and over again. In Seattle, I would just go outside to play basketball on the wet playground by myself. Didn't bother to invite my brothers, but just wanted to get out of the house, or just thumbing through shopping catalogs. Back then they would mail catalogs from A to Z, and you could just look through and thumb through and look for things that you might like. When I think back, sometimes I would see a kid playing, or my wife would see a kid playing basketball and say, oh, that's a cute little scene, right? The boy's like, I don't know about that. That kind of reminds me of a really sad time when that's all I remember of me just going out there playing, shooting hoops just to get away from home.
Okay.
And it's not that home was where in some cases clients come from, or friends have abusive homes or really difficult circumstances where you want to get away. This was just a home that did not have a lot of emotional nurturing and did not know it. So I just went out and tried to create my own, I guess my own place of safety. So that's where I found safety, playing basketball, just doing things on my own.
Yeah.
Where things, when I think about how did the sexual template come into play, there were times in the summer when we would watch, parents are gone working, and we would watch soap operas like Days of Our Lives. One of my very first sexual experiences was me going up to the TV screen and kissing the TV whenever I saw like an actress on there.
Yep.
And then obviously there was dust, and your reality is shattered because like, oh gosh, there's TV stuff.
Oh, shoot. Fantasy ruined.
But yet it's still hard to share that piece. Not that it was very sexual, but because of how deep the yearning was for connection. Another yearning, it was non-sexual, but came on TV, was there would be commercials and you would see like the family scene and the dad is playing catch with the son or so on and so forth. And this was all in early elementary, middle school age. And I remember I would just kind of just sit there and just, I won't say fantasize, but you would just let that image linger a little bit. I mean, I still remember those commercials to this day because they were so powerful because of my own lack of...
It was foreign.
Yeah, my own lack of connection and desire for both those elements, the family connection and also maybe the connection to a woman. When I think about the womanly connection, well, both from my parents' perspective, the other aspect of stoicism is you just don't touch your kids. There's no touching, there's no hugging.
Not the love language.
That's not their love language. They do, they cook, they clean, they provide, and that was what was done. Yeah. And the one time, or the instances when I do remember some level of engagement with my mom was when our ears would need to be cleaned, and she would use those Asian...
The spoon?
Not the spoon, but those metal...
The clip.
The metal little digger.
Yeah.
The thin little thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, obviously.
Well, that's a little curved on that.
Yeah,
right?
it's curved on the end.
Sure.
And you would lie on her lap, and then she was like, I think I'm all done. I was like, no, keep going. I feel more. And I would just say that to spend more time on her lap with my cheek on her lap. And then, you go both sides, left ear, right ear. But the same thing, like, no, Mom, keep doing it. I still feel more. And like, no, it's all done.
Just wanted that physical touch and connection. You must have had the cleanest ears in Seattle.
No, I think they were very dirty because they were very infrequently cleaned. And she was like, look, you got these nice little nuggets, right?
Oh, boy. Keep those nuggets.
But that still brings up just, I guess, warm memories because those were the few times when touch was allowed from our parents.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of the elementary, middle school age. As we fast forward, we start watching PG-13 movies that, although had some suggestive scenes in it, it really wasn't that much. But for people like me who were vulnerable to it, I latched onto it. So more specifically, there was a movie growing up, Weird Science, where the two teenagers created this woman out of a science experiment, and
Kelly LeBrock.
Yeah, and I don't remember nudity because it was, I think, PG or PG-13. But you're just fascinated by the intrigue of the female form.
Sure.
Then it does get a little bit more suggestive when Top Gun came out because there was that makeout scene, and oh my gosh, they're French kissing, and what does that mean? But this was all, unlike some of the clients I see, this was all pre-porn. Like I didn't really run into porn. Maybe I might have seen something here on the street, like a magazine here or there, but nothing was really etched into the brain.
And certainly nothing was as accessible as it is now.
Yeah, it wasn't accessible.
Yeah.
So all what was accessible was just whatever came through the TV screen. I do know that some of my friends had cable or scrambled cable, and you can like kind of jiggle the channels and might see something suggestive. But once again, it was kind of indirect. You couldn't really see it, but you knew it was there. But what I did have access to, newspapers, back then there was a lot of mailings, so lingerie ads, that came through. And so once again, those catalogs that I was looking at, I'm sure there were models, so you're just kind of looking at them and you start just remembering or in sex addiction therapy we call it body parting because I'm just like focused on the leg or whatever, like the face or this or that or a breast, and you just start compartmentalizing women in that particular way, and that was pretty much it. But there was still a lot of what I would say fantasy, not in the terms of sexual fantasy, because I had not engaged in sex up until this point, so I didn't even know what sexual fantasy is. my term of fantasy was I would see somebody, let's say in the catalog, and you would just look at the face for hours on end. In high school, we would exchange pictures. You get the pictures of yourself. You would exchange pictures with all the peers. Some students went to other schools like, hey, you have so-and-so's picture. I like her, or she looks attractive. Can you get one? Like, hey, or Sam, you could just keep mine, right? So there was.
Did you have the picture of the girl that told you not to wear the bell bottoms?
No.
She doesn't know to this day that you ruined your perfect school record.
Remind me of her because she was Caucasian, and so there's a cultural piece that I do want to circle back to. So I got the picture, and I remember I would just look at the picture all day long. I mean, it's just a headshot. There's nothing revealing. But the same thing when it came to other high school yearbooks. You would just go through the yearbooks and you would just look at the image and kind of either get encapsulated by the image, or there were real friends that I had met, or they may have been older women or older classmates that I had crushes on. And you would just linger and think about being with them. But remember, I didn't have any notion of sex.
Exactly what happens there.
Yeah, so I had not. There were no wet dreams yet. So all this stuff about orgasm and sex, it was just about being with a woman. So high school, that kind of it came on off and on. But at the time, I was involved in sports, so that detracted a lot of, or I spent a lot of time just focusing on sports and maybe not girlfriends. So didn't have a girlfriend in high school. And it wasn't. Oh yes.
I was going to say you get a sort of kind of connection sometimes through team sports. Obviously not in the same way as a romantic relationship, but it definitely keeps you focused on something else. Put it that way.
I was at least socialized. I was part of what was known as the Seattle Chinese Athletic Association, where they had boys and girls, not only Asian, but now anybody can play. But at the time, it was primarily anybody who was Asian to participate in sports, basketball primarily, if you didn't have high school or middle school, or if you weren't part of a city program. So there were boys and girls of our age, and you just learned to interact with them, which was good because I learned to be able to socialize, and I wasn't awkward around girls. But the part that was awkward was just the sense of adequacy, as now, let's say later senior years, I'm how do I fit into this world in terms of not only academic adequacy, but also relational adequacy. Am I good enough?
Yeah.
Circling back to what I mentioned earlier, because I'm growing up in a mixed ethnic neighborhood, I'm also faced with the challenge of trying to assimilate into a mainstream world, thinking, how do I fit in with mainstream white America as well?
Indeed.
So once in a while, our high school was 75% minority, but there were still white students there. So you kind of wonder, I mean, not only in high school, but the preceding years as well, can I be liked as being Asian? Like this is kind of a reference point, right? Will I be considered a nerd? Am I considered less than? How does this come into play? So I think starting in my college years, I either intentionally or unintentionally or unconsciously didn't date Asian women. For whatever reason. And I remember it's like, well, I just like white women. I think that was what I told myself.
The level of awareness you had at the time.
Had very limited.
That's my type.
I wanted acceptance more than anything.
Yeah.
So I thought that if I dated Asian, sure, I will get accepted because I'm one of you, right? But if I was to branch off and date white, how would that work?
Almost as if what I'm really craving is not just acceptance at a personal individual level, but there's sort of a symbolic societal acceptance.
That's the first time I've ever heard it articulated that way. But yes, I didn't even realize I was looking for both the personal affirmation, but the collective affirmation that, hey, you're okay not only as an individual but by society.
Yeah.
And so maybe on a subconscious level, if I dated white, hey, I must be okay because look, she's affirming me.
I'm really okay, and my type is okay, perhaps too.
Before, I did want to say my very first, if we can call it a girlfriend, it was a relationship of sorts, was with a Chinese girl from my Chinese church at the time. But that was very late high school, like end of senior year or bled into the beginning of my freshman year in college. And that brought a lot of shame just because that was my first sexual experience.
And that's a no-no.
Boy, that was
in the Chinese church.
In the Chinese church. Remember, my parents are just working folks. They may have had some Buddhist folk religion in the mix, but they didn't really have any. There was not a lot of morality or values taught to us other than be a good person, stay away from bad people. In high school, met some folks that went to church and say, hey, you know what? You might want to go to church. Might be good for you. So I went to church for the socialization piece. Yeah. Everything about Jesus and God went over my head. I was just undeveloped. I just couldn't understand what they were talking about.
You were there for a connection.
But I did know, what I felt I knew was I grew up in that family shame. And so in a strange way, Asian Christian church felt eerily familiar. Like, hey, I'm feeling that another layer of shame. I can roll with this.
It's actually comforting in a sense because it's familiar.
I know this shame. Yeah. It's just another layer. Okay, be a good person on home. Be a better person at church. If you're bad, feel some shame.
Stay within your lane. Keep it simple. Be a good person. Work hard.
Yeah. So it wasn't necessarily the church's message that was wrong, but how I misinterpreted it. So by the time I had sex with my girlfriend at the time, the shame was overwhelming.
For both of you?
Not for her.
Really?
There may have been some healthy guilt from her when I think back, but she was not embroiled in the level of shame that I was in.
Wow.
I didn't communicate this, but I remember thinking to myself, God hates me. That was the message. Oh gosh, I committed the unpardonable sin. We talk about waiting for marriage, right? Yep. And then this happened. So I said, okay, God must hate me. I was already transitioning to college, so this was a good time to eject myself from the church/Christian scene anyways. God hates me.
I messed up here. I better get out of here.
Nobody wants to see my face.
Oh boy. Of course, because everybody knew about it.
Nobody. I don't even know if anybody knew.
Joking,
but I just felt like people would know.
I'm hiding something.
God knew. That's all I knew.
Yeah.
That's all that
Fair
was
enough.
important. God knew, and he would hate me. So I just I don't know what I did. I just rolled around for a year and a half, and then I transferred to another school. Part of the shame dynamic was my mom primarily, because my dad was working. My mom had probably the strongest influence in terms of vocalizing her thoughts and beliefs. So I wanted to go into journalism at the time.
Yep.
I got into journalism school at the university, or it was communications. It was the School of Communications, and underneath that you can go into a number of different things, PR, journalism, and so on and so forth. I remember running home very excited and saying, Mom, look, I got accepted into the School of Communications, blah, 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 journalism. And she was like, what are you going to do with that? I'm like, well, I'm thinking television journalism. Look at the folks because she watched a lot of news at the time. So I was thinking maybe
I get to do that.
If I do that, Mom might be impressed or proud. She was like, no, they don't hire Asian men. Why don't you be a teacher? So I thought about it. I said, well, first she said, why don't you be an engineer, doctor, some of the more stereotypical professions. I said, nah, that's not for me. She was like, how about teaching? I was like, okay, maybe. So then I transferred schools an hour and a half away that was known for being a teaching university.
How quickly you got your mind changed there?
Well, yeah, I was the oldest son. I had
That's right.
to kind of listen and obey
That's right.
and follow these rules.
Mm-hmm.
So while I was in college, I remember, even though I'm away, I would meet folks who would invite me to weekly Christian worships or gatherings. And I just remember, like, gosh, if you guys really knew what I had gone through, there's just no way you would accept me. These are mostly white Christians at the time, because I was going to, at the time, it was primarily, a white university.
And it stands out to me how quickly there was this, I gotta hide, right, the shame, and escape, get out of this church environment, go somewhere else, and then I find myself in another place where even still I've got to hide something.
Hiding and escaping, Martin, those work very well with sexual secrecy.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's also part of the dynamic, sex and secrecy kind of go together, especially in certain families or cultures, if you don't talk about it. So that lent itself very well to me. Not only am I hiding and living the secrecy, now I'm actually physically an hour and a half, 2 hours drive away from home. I was living in the dorms now, as opposed to commuting.
Yeah.
I didn't know anybody. I had to recreate an identity in a primarily white community too. So everything was very odd to me.
Especially coming from your high school environment and your neighborhood.
Yeah, so I graduated from Rainier Beach High School, which is known for producing, like, Jamal Crawford went there, from Nate Robinson.
Sure.
Earlier than that, Doug Christie. So a lot of NBA players either went to our high school or from the Seattle area. And so we listened to a lot of hip hop and R&B and soul. Yeah. When I transferred to, it was Western Washington University in Bellingham on the Canadian border, everybody was listening to grunge and other kind of music. And I was like, what?
Cool.
Like, and they're like, Sam, why are you listening to that kind of music, right? And I was like, this is the music, like, I'm used to growing up in. But already I was feeling a little bit of the twinge of even the shame of where I grew up that was layered on top of all the other cultural and family shame I had inherited, and the sexual shame that was kicking in too. Yeah, so in college, it was just a blur of trying to, since I already had sinned, it's like, let's just keep going, right?
I already got the parking ticket. I'll just keep my car here.
It wasn't intentional, because there was really a longing for relationship when I look back, but I didn't know how to be in relationships, so the only thing I knew was what I saw, so what I saw was being sexual. If I was sexual, that meant I was in relationship. And so when I dated, they were fairly short-lived. Maybe the longest was 8 months, but I don't remember having anything substantive come out of it. These were primarily sexual relationships. Everything from, so we would go to clubs and bars and whatever, parties, and they would either be one-night stands or dating for a few weeks, and then it fizzled out because I wanted to break it off for fear that they would break up with me, find me wanting.
Yeah.
Or maybe my last year, I ended up dating a gal for 8 months. But I knew it would end because I was going into journalism. Yeah. So there was a natural ending that I didn't have to be accountable for, so to speak. So once again, there's no porn. Right? We haven't talked about porn yet.
These are all real people.
These are real people where I was just constantly on the hunt for, whether we call it sexual validation, affirmation, relational affirmation. It's all somewhat interrelated. Sure. I just wanted to feel affirmed, and being sexual was the one way that I felt I could connect with a woman. When I moved to my first job in journalism, finally moved away to Montana, now we actually enter going down the pornographic route because, well, it escalated. It didn't just go straight to porn. I'm hunting, but I'm working, so I don't have time to find women. It was not that easy. So I would go to the, at the time that you could go to the Blockbuster or what have you and rent movies. But the movies that you could rent there were a lot of, the ones I rented were B-rated and had some sexual content. They may have had nudity. It was like crime, not crime, like there's a gun involved and there's not murder, but there's like, I don't know. It was just really bad movie, but I didn't want to watch the movie. I just wanted to get to the sexual piece because I knew that's why they had them.
That was developing into the drug of choice.
Yeah. But that quickly started to escalate because this was not enough. Like, gosh, I got to watch a 2-hour movie and wait for a 10-minute scene that didn't even lead to actual sex. Like, this is like just leaving me frustrated. So eventually I found the adult bookstore in town. I went in and I think I just bought a stack of magazines, and that at that time I was probably 23 or 24, which is fairly old compared to some of the clients and people I meet now that have seen introduced for pornography
really
much earlier. But nevertheless, the hooks went in pretty deep instantaneously because I was not going to go to B-rated movies anymore if I could go to this.
You have this, yeah.
So I went to that. There may have been a reprieve of sorts when I dated briefly in Montana. But if you're wondering, I'm not sure if you're wondering why pornography then, I thought about it and I realized, years later, like, gosh, for the first time, the anxiety and the fear of living now we're 8 hours drive away from home. I could not call my parents because no cell phones were around. I didn't buy long distance phone calling because what am I really going to talk to my parents about? Pre-internet, so there were no connections. I literally was on my own now.
In Montana,
which I thought was going to be very white. I was scared. I can say that now, but back then I could not. I was scared, lonely, and afraid that I was just going to bomb in my career.
Yeah.
With all these feelings, I didn't know what to do, and slowly the pornography, the orgasm, it just kept those feelings suppressed for years on end.
How long were you out there?
Just a year. But then I moved because you're always trying to move up in the journalism world, or when you're starting off at least. So then I moved to Ohio. So now gulf from my Asian American neighborhood that gave me some semblance of safety. Now I'm terrified. Not only are the stakes higher, when I was in Montana, everybody's starting off. The pressure's low. I'm a photographer. I'm a videographer. I'm the editor, all rolled into one.
Wow.
I think I made $13,000 a year. It was just peanuts just to get started. By the time I moved to Toledo, Ohio, the stakes were higher because now I was just going to be the reporter. So now, like, the anxiety was really kicking in. I had my stash of porn. Videos were also now more readily available. So I had videos that I would watch. Now we could probably say we're starting to get into a daily rhythm of watching it. Maybe in Montana it was like episodic, but now I remember once we got to Toledo.
Part of your daily routine?
This started to become daily.
Like come home, part of your unwind routine, or wake up first thing?
People don't have very good memories.
No, fair enough. Yeah, you're not fully present
when you're just drugged out. So I just remember if I couldn't go clubbing with either by myself or with some of my colleagues and try to pick up women, which was usually unsuccessful, I would just go back and numb out with the porn that I had, or just the movies that I had already purchased. I did not want to buy new ones because I felt now that I was in Toledo, I could be seen in the public and like, oh my gosh, that's the local broadcaster going in and buying porn. So I really had to keep the public piece of me purchasing it as private as possible.
So you was really developing into a daily habit at this point.
It was daily.
And at some point, this is you got married while living out there, yeah?
Met my first wife there. She was unaware of what was going on, but we dated.
Would you have called it a problem at that point, or were
we did call it a problem because we had dated for a couple years, and then we went to see premarital counseling. And then the therapist asked, hey, is there anything that we should be aware of? And either she says, well, he looks at this stuff. And I said, yeah, I do. What should we do? This is like 97 or something like that. This is even before anybody knew anything. So
not a lot of resources,
nothing
awareness then. Yeah.
His prescription was possibly to exposure therapy. Maybe if you expose it to him more often, it would go away. Maybe I misinterpreted it, so I do want to
think for the rationale on
but
that.
in my mind, it's like, oh gosh, do more porn? Okay, I could do that. I did more porn. It didn't go away. It went underground, and then I moved to Cincinnati from Toledo.
Okay.
But now it's, as you can probably see, the stakes are getting even higher. Like, Sam, one of the first questions I get, I'm like 27 at the time. Most of the journalists in Cincinnati are older. Sam, do you know why you got hired? Well, it's not because of your ability. It's because of what you could be, or how we project you. So just keep that in mind. You're never hired for your current abilities. It's always for
your potential.
Yeah, your potential. So then you're really starting to sweat because all eyes are on you. I'm thinking, physically all eyes are on you when you're watching the news, right? You're whoever's on that channel is watching you, so you don't want to make any on-air mistakes, in addition to just mistakes in life. But I was already going down this route of being deeply involved in the pornography. I think my wife turned a blind eye for a couple years. Yeah. Either she turned a blind eye or I just hid it very well. It was a combination of both. Okay. So I'm doing that every day. Then fast forward to getting an offer in Los Angeles. Okay. So we moved to Los Angeles. Now I remember it was daily because the stress was it was too much.
And moved for a better job, I assume, too.
Depends how you quantify better. Okay. I thought it was better because I'm on the West Coast, Asian communities, closer to home, so on and so forth, and bigger city, right? So your pay goes up. But it was stressful in the sense that I just didn't feel adequate because I felt like I didn't give myself enough time to be more seasoned in journalism. To really get polished. So now I'm thrust, as opposed to going to a news conference of 3 or 4 other journalists. In a normal news conference in Ohio, there are maybe, just a handful of other reporters, print and TV. Now I'm at a news conference in LA.
Small fish in a big pond here. Yeah.
You look around the room, there are like 30-something people. And not only 30-something people, there are some legends, apparently, like not only newscasters, but also photographers. Like, oh, don't you know, I think his name is Nick Ut. He was the photographer for the AP who took that famous photograph from the Vietnam War where the little girl's running with the napalm. Like, that's him. Like, oh my gosh, things that you can't even imagine. Yep. It starts becoming surreal. Combine that with at-home issues, if I can call it that. How I justified it, I said, well, if I just continue to look at porn, then I can take care of this piece and not bother her.
Right.
Like, we could still have a good marriage. I mean, literally, this is what I thought. Sure. We could have a good marriage. I don't ever have to bother her about this, and I can just take care of this piece on my own.
You can have intimacy somewhere else. And
so that went on for almost 2 years, and I can still remember the piercing. In the middle of the night, I worked a swing shift, got home after the 10 or 11 o'clock news, my daily ritual, get online, look at porn, and she was usually asleep by that time. She woke up one evening to use the restroom. She saw me in the living room and gasped, "What are you doing?" And like,
uh-oh.
I was paralyzed. It was like, I don't even know how to describe the feelings. Everything was swirling inside. It was panic, terror, everything you can imagine, all at once.
Makes me think of the younger Sam lying about the paper route and getting caught.
Yeah.
Except on another scale, of course.
This was big now because now this was close to year 2000. I was kind of left struggling, not only relationally, obviously sexually, but also spiritually, because I looked to her family as spiritual mentors. And I kept thinking, well, I don't really know that much about Christianity, but I thought, marriages were important. I thought somewhere we try to work it out. And I know that what I did or what I'm doing or what's been discovered is not, it's not kosher, but like,
Don't we work at this, right? Divorce is, you don't do that.
It felt fairly knee jerk. We tried to see a couple of therapists, and I was kind of left wondering what to do. Year 2000, what am I going to do?
Not a lot of resources still, right?
Not a lot of resources.
Well, I'm just picturing, as you said, probably the re-triggered trust and betrayal and violation for her, and for you, the sense of exposed shame that we've talked about from the start. Just, that's a large gap to bridge.
I'm exposed, helpless, with very limited resources, and we don't call it porn addiction. You can't just Google porn addiction therapy. There's none of that.
Yeah.
Somehow, I'm not even sure how this all came into play. I saw a psychologist referred from somebody from the church I was attending, and went to see him for a year. At the same time, either he or somebody else gave me a referral to a therapist in Orange County that ran a men's group that dealt with sexual stuff.
What?
And I didn't know what this was about. But so I think somewhere 3 months into individual, I was also going down to Orange County once a week for group therapy.
Wow.
And we didn't even call it, there was no such, the terminology, it was just, we're struggling with pornography, sex, whatever it was. You're coming in and you're talking about it.
And how was that?
The most terrifying therapeutic relational experience initially of my life, but also the most helpful long term.
Yep.
Once I got over the stigma of individual therapy, you can do that. But to go into a group of other people, I still can recall the feelings of, I'm not like these people, meaning I'm better.
These people really have a problem.
I'm going to walk into a room with people who have horns growing out of their heads. They must be really despicable people. They really must be the scums of the earth. They're not like me. And then I walked in and they were so welcoming.
Wow.
They were so honest, but they were also so normal.
No, not that different from you.
I was shocked. I was like, this can't be this. I just had a different image of people in trench coats, or I don't know what I was thinking. Like just people wearing all black and hiding themselves, and like I just. Sure. But these were regular folks who had regular jobs, who had regular relationships, either in the midst of repair or going down the divorce path with kids, some without kids, and
everyday guys.
The way that just them being regular guys made me realize that, oh my, I might just be normal too, in a way. Like, they were able to break down the shame much more than I could, because some of these guys had been in group therapy for a couple years now.
That's powerful. Yeah, just the sense of normalization and taking that top layer of shame off, huh?
Even though I don't recall individual therapy experiences, even though I had gone through close to 5 years of it, I do remember group experiences very vividly. One moment was when I came in. I always had that happy face, right? Remember from my family background. And like, Sam, your check-ins don't jive. And I said, what are you talking about? These are group members challenging me. They're like, well, you're coming in, you're saying these painful things that happened to you throughout your week, but you're just sitting there with a smile on your face. And they said, Sam, in some type of, they use some phrase like, you're not being real. You're just not being true to who you are. And that hit me, because they did it not in a mean-spirited way, but in a firm way, saying you really need to get in touch with the pain. You're not getting in touch with it. And slowly I kept coming back, and I was finally able to touch the pain.
Can you talk about that moment, or was there one particular incident when you recall touching that pain the first time?
I just remember driving home from Orange County, a lot of time to think, and I would pray, like, hey, I'm tired of these empty prayers from the past, more money, better job, blah, blah, blah. Like, hey, what about what these guys just asked? They just want me to be able to own my feelings, to be able to feel the feelings. Can you just give me that, God? And surely it started opening up. I'm not sure which pain I started feeling first, but I think obviously the pain of the divorce started kicking in, and I could be more real and honest with that. But in addition to that, pain that I never wanted to address, such as childhood pain, that was, in therapy we call it little T's, the cumulative trauma, because it's not big trauma. I didn't go through, I'm not a refugee from the Vietnam War. I didn't see bodies and people killed. But I did experience the cumulative pain of neglect, not having parents I could connect with, not having not anybody actually, adults whom I could feel safe around. So that level of pain started coming out, and tears started to. Everything. I became congruent, right? My feelings and the way I physically expressed it became congruent.
What would you say, briefly, the journey from sort of being able to connect with those feelings on a deeper level, what was the path from there to really sort of recovering and getting a handle on, I guess, what we might call now an addiction?
Yeah. So many facets once you get connected to yourself. In addition to the pain, you become more self-aware in terms of why you do what you do. Mm-hmm. So I started reevaluating all aspects of my life. One area that I had to reevaluate was my work. Why am I working? Why am I working in journalism? What is this about? It's a painful reality. But I realized part of the reason of going into journalism was I really wanted affirmation from my parents.
I heard you say that from the start, yeah.
My mom watched to learn English. She watched a lot of news. And so, part of it was I wanted to write, I liked writing and storytelling. But the other part that was missing or out of my own understanding was a desire to get affirmed from my parents. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking, if I don't get affirmed by my parents, at least I will have what? Public.
A broad audience.
Public affirmation. Who wouldn't want that? But after going through therapy, I was like, I don't need this. And I said, I could take a job in journalism and be hidden, and I would be okay with that. But that was very unlike my earlier years where I needed the limelight because that was what kept me going to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. So that was one area that, eventually that level of self-awareness said, well, what am I? What do I like doing? And at the time, I kept pitching to my news director stories about therapy, addictions, mental health. Oh. And they said, Sam, have you thought about like doing this full time? Because they could just see this.
Right. It's coming out of you.
I couldn't see it. Mm-hmm. And I said, what do you mean? Like, well, like getting a degree and going into this. And I said, okay. So eventually went to grad school, got my degree. And up until that time, it was a transition. It took about, from the divorce to actually grad school, probably about 4 years. It wasn't that quick, knee-jerk decision. Read a lot of books. Some of the books that stood out are books on trauma, books on culture, books on addiction, books on boundaries, and how I lacked an understanding of some of these, a lot of these basic principles.
Sure.
Like, what is a need? What is a want? How do you express that? I didn't know how to express that because those needs and wants were never fostered in childhood. So I'm now relearning things in adulthood, both in therapy world and outside.
It seems like so much of, you and I probably as therapists speak similar language, but for someone who is a layperson, I'm wondering if we can put it into words too. What developed as a problematic habit for you? In what way that met a need that was not being met?
Well, I knew I could always be so when normally when you think of a more traditional addiction like drugs or alcohol or food, you think of the accessibility to it, right? Porn or sexual stuff is accessible. I can always get it. It's dependable. I needed something dependable. And I tried some of the other avenues. I tried alcohol, but me being Asian, I have an allergic reaction to it. I tried gambling. I did not like losing money. So some of my peers growing up from our environment, a lot of them have gambling issues. I do have a co-addiction that I do want to mention. So I didn't gamble, but I did do a lot of spending. So similar to when I used to look at catalogs and find things I would like this electronic, I would circle it and think about, oh, it's going to cost this much money. Well, once in my adulthood, on my own, left to my own devices, whenever I had one time I had a bad day. Well, I thought it was a really bad day because I got rejected from a Christian woman in terms of, I don't even know if it was dating. It was just thinking about dating. And she's like, well, Sam, you're divorced and biblically, we can't really date you as a Christian.
There's a big D on your forehead.
And I was like, really? That's what the Bible says? So I remember I cried. So I was able to cry, called my friend up, my guy friend, and cried. So that was a start. But the other piece, I needed a salve for that pain. And I would go to the Glendale Galleria, and I remember buying a couple of suits. And before you know it, at the end of the day, it was like $2,000 spent. And so once in a while, there are those moments back then where spending would just get out of control because I was going through much pain. And another friend and I would joke about it and said, Sam, you're hemorrhaging. That was like our term, like you're going through a bad spell.
Yeah.
But going back to the sexual piece, it was problematic because it fulfilled the need, like the accessibility, what it validated, what it affirmed. And it was my drug of choice. Nothing else gave me that high. And I had tried a lot of, I wrote down some other co-addictions that I have tried and have had other people try. Exercise, since I grew up in a somewhat sports-minded community, tried doing all kinds of stuff from marathons, triathlons, martial arts. They give you a certain high, but it never gave me the same sexual high that I could get with pornography. And being more explicit on your podcast, the orgasm piece. I mean, that just gave me a high that made everything else feel better.
What would be your experience after coming down off a high or after viewing pornography and having an orgasm? How long would that last?
We call it the shame and addiction cycle. So I would have that high, but I mean, as soon after the orgasm, I mean, almost instantaneously, the shame would set in. I mean, it's not like you get to bask in this high for a while. Like, oh my gosh, just what happened? Sure. Like, what did you do? And I would start hiding again. I don't want to see my friends. I don't want to associate with Christians. I don't want to have conversations with anybody about anything. This was during the pre-recovery or the early recovery stages.
Sure.
Once I got better at recovery, I'm not sure if you want me to talk what that looks like.
Yes,
and the mind gets very crafty. So even though you may go through periods of being porn free, your mind still goes to, in our terminology, sexual recovery. There's always the images that you can go back to or the experiences. So one thing that we talk about is called euphoric recall. You can always go into that. I don't ever have to look at another image again to still go back to past real experiences or images that I had seen. So there's still even to this day, a wrestling of that piece that I need to work on. But maybe to fill in some of the gaps between grad school and now, which covers a span of close to 12 years, is there's some ups and downs too. So yeah, sure, I went through some recovery initially in LA. Then I moved to Portland. Once again, I was isolated, restarting on my own. But this piece, I thought I could do it on my own. I may have seen a therapist briefly, but I tried to do some things on my own. Failed disastrously in terms of what I would say taking escalating once again. So not just pornography. There were some massage parlors, went overseas a couple times, some red light districts, some prostitutes. So it actually, I think, got worse before it got better. Getting better, eventually I returned back to Seattle about 8 years ago. I had to humble myself, even though I was a therapist, and start getting connected to 12-step communities.
Yeah.
I tried to go. They didn't have anything on. There wasn't an Asian American anything for us struggling, right? So I just had to go to the tried and true one. So I would go to 12-step ones, but this became an unsafe place too, because at the time I was working at a group sex addiction practice. And I ended up bumping into other clients.
Wow.
They weren't my clients, but they, you would see them in the hallways, and then they would throw a fuss, or, they didn't throw a fuss, but one gentleman said, "Hey, I saw Sam in a 12-step recovery. How's this possible? Blah, 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 blah." And so now I'm in a weird double bind because I'm a therapist struggling in this, or not struggling, but in recovery in this area, but now cannot go to the places that I thought could be my safe recovery places.
Yeah.
I jumped back into a group therapy piece, but this was more process group with men, so it wasn't just sexual. Yeah, so I did that, and then more recently, I found a church closer to home that is more, well, we'll use the word addiction, more porn and sex addiction related, that I've been attending for the past 6 months now. It's a better fit.
I see. And just so I'm clear, the church is attentive to these kinds of issues and creates a space for you to be dealing with it.
Oh yeah, it's great. Nobody knows why we're there. I mean, it's a big church. A lot of activities happen on Wednesday. They have childcare, so sometimes I drop off my 2-year-old, and it feels like a joint thing. Like,
Okay.
I'm doing this as a family. People are there. People are checking you in. There's not thousands, but a lot of other things going on that. There's no shame. I don't really have a shame going there, compared to even when I was going to the 12-step group. Like, wife, I got to go to the 12-step group. It's my time alone again,
Yep. What was it like dating and remarrying again after having gone through this process and just being at a different place?
Dating either terrified people when I don't even hide that piece. Like, hey, I'm divorced right off the bat when I was dating. So they either scattered or they were okay with it. But then, whether it was through group therapy, it was primarily through group therapy, because I remember one of the stories the guys was telling me when he was dating. It's like, "Sam, it's so great to be out there dating honestly." I was like, "What do you mean?" It's like, I could just tell him in our early dating, meaning like probably within the first 2 months, that I've struggled in this area, I'm working on it, and this is me. Kind of take it or leave it. Whereas that was like a shock. Like, how could you do that? How could you do that? But I had learned. So then by a few years later, when it was my turn, I don't think it was that easy as in take it or leave it, for at least from my perspective. But at least I could say it. I say, "Hey, you know what? I've gone through some things. I mentioned the divorce earlier. Now I'd like to share why I got divorced. I went through, I struggled with pornography. I don't know if I use the word addiction because maybe the women may not understand it, but this is a struggle that it's definitely a compulsive habit that I would turn to alleviate my feelings. And the women were very understanding. And then obviously my now wife,
right, obviously was very understanding.
Yeah.
About it. Thankfully, boy. So at this point, I guess I know in at least the sort of recovery 12-step community, they use certain language.
Once an addict, always an addict?
Yeah, one day at a time. The language. But, at least sort of 12-step culture wasn't necessarily part of your journey.
No.
What I hear. But do you measure or mark sort of how long you've been in remission or sober? Or
sobriety?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I do have a working, so when I say a porn image, it's been about 2 years since I've intentionally seen an image. But in terms of just acting out, any type of, so I would say everybody has a different definition. If I'm just masturbating regardless of nothing, like even if I'm just doing it for sensual pleasure, I would say I broke my sobriety.
Okay.
So it's funny that we have this podcast now, because last week I had a break of going to euphoric recall. I actually like really hurt my back.
Oh.
I know. And trying to pick up my baby and like,
Oh, that'll do it.
but it's worse than it's almost as bad as doing one of those heavy lifts, or just as bad. And yeah, I just couldn't get out. I was popping a leave and this and that, and eventually it's like, you know what? I hate to go there, but I felt like I wanted to go there. So I went there about a week ago, and that kind of broke the 2-year streak of sorts. So, but I don't really have any shame in that, and I try to really tell my clients, like, you know, you might have a break here and there. I don't want you to get too fixated on the number, because sometimes in 12-step communities you start worshiping the number more so than
what chip do I get and what keychain.
You worship that more so than your own personal growth and journey, which might be a little different from what most recovery communities, or even what places that sometimes when they ask you to speak, they want to hear this great trajectory of, you know, you've always been porn free for X number of years. Like, that's not my message. I'm telling you that right now, so you know whether to invite me or not. It can be up and down, but I do know that I do try to work on it, grow from it, learn from it, and continue to be held accountable to it.
If you were talking to anyone out there who may be in the throes of some sort of compulsive or addictive problem with sex, pornography, acting out, what have you, what would be sort of one major thing you'd want them to hear from you or from your experience?
One thing that I got from group therapy that was not expressed was I finally learned how to love somebody in a non-sexual way. I could never say that before. Meaning I could honestly say, hey, I love John or Jim or Bill. Yeah.
Male, female.
Yeah. In a non-sexual way. But more importantly, because there wasn't, I didn't have attraction to men. So being able to love them was even more enlightening to me, because I always thought love, romance was really tied together with my attraction to women. So that was the big piece, if we think more kind of widely, but on a more personal level, if somebody is struggling, how do you acknowledge? Part of it was breaking the denial. You either have to come to it on your own, or somebody else has to pierce your denial.
Indeed.
90% of the time, somebody else pierces it. The other piece is, if you think you have a problem, it might be helpful to at least start meeting other people on a more, in some of these safe environments. Group therapy was really great for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I really can still visually remember the guys in the room, their faces, their personalities, the therapist in the backdrop. Like, I just remember it all, and I still cherish those moments, because they were so healing. Yeah. If it's appropriate, then the group environment would be the best therapeutic tool, if that's all somebody could afford. But acknowledging it, and then this is the hard part, how do you share that? If you're in a relationship, share that with your partner or spouse, because it is didn't mention it, but it is kind of a 2-track road of recovery.
Indeed. So that was my other sort of winding down question, is for someone who's listening who is in a relationship, they're a partner or spouse of someone who they suspect, or maybe it has come out, has problem with sex or pornography. A word of advice for that person.
The spouses are more likely than not going to take it very personally. They're going to feel that their faults have led to your acting out. Because I remember at the time, my first wife wondered if she was physically inadequate. I said, there's nothing wrong with you.
Not about that.
Trust me, this preceded you. If I didn't meet you, it was another woman, it would have still happened. but that's all just head talk.
Can't compute at
Yeah,
that
yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah. So just be mindful that spouses are going to take it very personally. And what I've seen, there can be a lot of body alterations or thoughts about, reconstructive surgery, plastic surgery.
Yeah.
What do they do?
Let me change something about me to
not
make
only
this
change
okay.
them physically, but then sexually, they may want to do things that maybe they think you might be interested in terms of what they think you're seeing in porn or have seen, and that's usually not the case either that I want.
And nor is that going to really address the issue.
Right.
Yeah.
That definitely doesn't address the issue.
Sam, any just final words as we kind of wind down here today? You shared so much, so personally and so bravely.
I think my next hurdle, if we can call it a hurdle, is I've been able to stuff a lot of my fears down. And yeah, we have the fears of job and work and relationships, layoffs, economic security, so on and so forth. But I'm at an age where I start having a lot more fear existentially. Like, what does my life mean? My life's going to end someday. I go to funerals, right? So you're reminded of that. And so that fear is very palpable, and I have to wrestle with that more and more. And so this is just for to share with you that this is what I struggle with, and I know that in the back of my mind, this is what I'm supposed to go through. Meaning, if I just stuff it away and drown it out with shopping or, doing this or that or exercising ad nauseum or looking at porn, I don't get to grapple with the life issues I should be grappling with. So there's a reason why we do certain things and why we numb out certain feelings, because they're hard. But I think part of what I want to get across is there are some things that we need to walk through. I need to be able to face death and wonder and think, what about meaning? What is life about? Because if I just numb out, I won't change, because I won't have access to even wanting to change.
Very similarly to how when you first started getting help for problematic sexual behaviors, you had to experience and feel real feelings and cry tears and feel anger and deal with the disconnect in a different way.
Sex is, or the compulsive, however we want to describe it, it's just the tip. We're talking about life underneath. I mean, this is just the very tip.
A symptom too.
It's
right.
It's just one aspect of the breadth and depth of each individual's life circumstances, their challenges, their stressors, their frustrations, but also their hopes, their aspirations, their joys, because that piece can be suppressed too.
You and I both know as therapists, so often and in so many different ways, what we don't talk about can get acted out. And this is one of those things. And I so appreciate you talking about your personal experience so openly here. And, I hope, again, people listening who may be dealing with it themselves, maybe, right, a spouse or partner or other therapists, we all can gain and learn from your experience. And also I should say, just, hats off to you and congratulations for, hopefully having this be mostly in the rearview mirror, and what you've been able to not just heal from, but to take your own struggle and experience with this and turn it into all the prolific writings and poetry and blogging and speaking, and what you're doing as a therapist to help people with this. I have to think that that's also a very meaningful thing as you sort of talk about dealing with existential meaning, yeah?
Well, you spend so much time doing one thing. When you give up something, you're going to have a lot of time to focus on other things. And that's the outer circle, positive, regenerative behaviors or things that I focus on to as part of my recovery.
Sure. Well, once again, thank you, Sam, for talking so openly, for all the work that you're doing here. And I've appreciated getting to know you and hopefully what we're talking about here. I mean, I'm just thinking to go back, in Asian circles, in Christian circles, this is not something that gets talked about, right? Maybe there's movement in general at a broad societal level, but generally speaking, in those circles, that you and I both know it's not something we talk about. But as therapists, maybe this is one of those things that we're partly why we do what we do and why we're grateful to be in the therapeutic culture we can appreciate, and campaigns about mental health issues and behavioral health issues and stigma. We're able to have this conversation now. And it's very much those efforts of our field that have hopefully have been part of you getting help you need, and in turn being able to be part of that workforce. So congratulations and thank you again, Sam.
Thank you for having me on the podcast.
My pleasure. And a pleasure as well to have you tune in and listen to this conversation with me and Sam Louie, MFT in Seattle. A couple quick follow-up thoughts. As we said before, there's definitely growing awareness and understanding, resources for training and therapy approaches for sex addiction, and just recognition of it as a genuine issue. And so if you're in that camp who, is sensitive to this issue and in the know and has been affected by it, but is trying to change the culture around it or get help around it, that's great. But I do think it remains for a lot of people out there, when they hear the term sex addiction or sex addict, I think there definitely is a pervasive tendency in a lot of circles to think all sorts of terrible things. And, I hope for someone who may be new to this issue or just kind of hearing about this for the first time, from Sam's story, you can hear, he wasn't out there trying to hurt anyone or looking for trouble, not trying to do anything weird or perverted. He didn't have some horrible, dark, at least, capital T traumatic incident from his childhood, as he said, that drove this problem. He was really just another kid trying to grow up in this country, figuring out how to relate to others and to his own experience in a real and intimate way. And sex certainly is a way to create the illusion of that. But as we said, just like with so many other addictions, substances, problematic habits, it's not typically a long-term solution. I think it's important to note, having a problem with sex or an addiction to sex or pornography is not the same thing. By no means equates to being a sex offender or having an affinity for abusing children. And I think you can really, again, see from Sam's story that while his relationship with sex was certainly destructive to him directly in the end, as well as to his previous relationship, that it really came from a place of vulnerability and an unmet need. And certainly not from a place of malice or desire to manipulate or cause harm. Now, that's not to downplay or minimize the damage or sense of betrayal that something like this can inflict on oneself or a partner, but just to highlight that, as Sam was saying at the end there, as always, behavior is coming from a deeper place. It's a symptom. It comes from a more complex context an inner world that needs to be explored and understood. And for Sam, as you heard, there were plenty of lies and lack of awareness that he had to go through and have unearthed. And that was a long process, but he had to go through that to get to a place of healthier living. And it really wasn't about anyone else at that point. So very generous of Sam to come and share his time and his story with us. As usual, feel free to share your comments and feedback with me. I'd love to hear how you interacted with our conversation. Send me an email at martin@psychrallypodcast.com or at Psych Rally on Twitter or on Facebook. Next up, for episode 29, we will be hearing about some recent research about the medical and mental health care of the Asian American population. Both some concerning findings, as well as some implications for psychotherapy with Asian Americans. And this is going to be straight out of the halls of academic psychology. No pun intended there. We're going to be talking with a researcher. His name is Dr. Hall, Dr. Gordon C. Nagayama Hall. He's a psychologist at the University of Oregon. And there are some findings in medicine we'll be talking about that could literally save you or a loved one's life. So stay tuned for episode 29 of The Rally.